Well, good morning, small part of the church family and large part of the church family out there in the ether. I have the great privilege of speaking to you today on Esther chapter 4. I think this is the passage that is at the very heart of the book of Esther, and it has the two, I think, key lines in it that help us to understand how we should think about this book that doesn't mention God at all. And those two lines we'll focus on specifically as we get further into the message. I think I do have a whole note here about retelling the story, but maybe I'll leave that to the kids. I think the kids did a really good job retelling the story, and they actually highlighted one of the key things about the story is finally they got some words to say. They actually had words from Mordecai and words from Esther to speak. And in biblical narrative, that's actually really important and really significant. So in this message today, we're going to focus on those words because they're at the very heart of the passage. But I will give a very brief summary just to get you back up to speed. Queen Vashti has been deposed in chapter 1 because she refused to come to the king. There was a beauty pageant and Esther was selected to replace her. And then we had an episode where there was a plot against the king's life and Mordecai overheard it and reported it. But despite saving the king's life, it was actually Haman who was promoted to a position of great influence and power. And in the last chapter, we saw that Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, and Haman was not impressed. And so Haman plotted to take out not just Mordecai, but all of Mordecai's people, and got an edict issued that assured their destruction in 11 months' time. And that's where we begin in chapter 4. We begin with that edict being published, a rather confused populace in the capital, and probably an equally confused populace throughout the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire. And I'm not going to focus very much on the first half of chapter 4. If you do want to know my thoughts, they're reported on the devotions, so you can go and have a look at that, because I think at the heart of this passage, yes, Mordecai's really upset, there's weeping, there's lamenting, there's confusion on behalf of Esther, what's going on, and eventually Esther hears about this edict, and she tries to clothe Mordecai, and there's a lot of symbolism, I think, in that. But I want to focus just on the conversation that happens between Esther and Mordecai. Because in biblical narrative, the words that are stated are actually quite important, and biblical narrative is designed to draw our attention to them, because if we think about it, we're almost halfway through this book and we haven't heard a word from Mordecai and we haven't heard a word from Esther. And that's 4.5 chapters in and they haven't said a thing. So we've been a little bit guessing about who they are and what their motivations are and why they're doing the things they're doing. We have to speculate from their actions about their character and their decisions. And what have we learnt about that so far? If you think about the first 3.5 chapters, Esther is very, very passive. She is acted upon. She is compliant. She is obedient. And we see that in her first words. Obedience is important to her. And what about Mordecai? We know that Mordecai is ambitious. We also know that he's more than a little bit stubborn. And we also know that he is concerned for his charge. He is concerned for Esther. That's what I think we can draw from their actions about their character and motivations. But now the author of Esther has given us insight directly into their thoughts, and we can hear what they think. Is Esther just a cipher, just a dumb beauty queen, literally? And we find that, well, maybe there's more to Esther than meets the eye. So let's have a look. Esther's first words in the whole book are found in chapter 4, and she says, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days." What do we learn about Esther from those words? We know that she's very conscious of the fate of her predecessor. Vashti was called to go into the king and boldly chose not to go. And it cost her high position. She was deposed as queen. And now Mordecai is asking Esther to boldly go when she is not called. And Esther knows that it won't just be her position that it will cost her. It will be her very life. There are rules that everybody knows, and she spells it out. In case you don't know Mordecai, this is a big deal. This is serious, and I haven't been called to come to the king for a month. Maybe I'm out of favour. Maybe that favour that ran through those first 3 chapters and got me to this position, maybe that's run out. Maybe my month is up. Her passivity is clear throughout the story, and she wishes to remain passive at this point. She's not inclined. She's terrified, and rightly so. So we have insight into her state of mind. She doesn't want to do this. It's a bit too scary. What does Mordecai say in response? And Mordecai's words are at the very heart, I think, of this passage, of this book. "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" We might think those are a little bit harsh there's nods, and Tony agrees. Maybe that's a bit harsh, Uncle Mordecai, what does he actually say? He says 3 things. He says, first, don't think your position will save you. You're a Jew, you'll get killed just like the rest of us. There's nothing special about your position. Death will come and find you as well. Second, and this is an amazing statement of faith. This is where we actually see that Mordecai is not a completely sold out Jew. He isn't just a career bureaucrat in the Persian Empire, but he does have a faith in Yahweh. For he says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place." He expresses complete confidence that even though God is absent and seemingly ignoring the plight of his people, that is not the the cosmic reality. Deliverance will rise from another place. It is a great statement of faith. And it comes with a sting in the tail. Maybe it is a little bit harsh. You and your father's house will perish. Don't think that you'll escape. God will save his people, but he may not save you if you do not speak up at this point. It's very bold. These are bold words trying to encourage a bold act. And what's his final statement? And this is probably the theme of the book of Esther. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And as we work through Esther, and as we have worked through Esther, that is probably the high point of the story. It's probably the lens through which we need to understand what's going on. For such a time as this. It's the words that echo in my mind whenever I'm reading and preparing devotions and writing stuff. I'm thinking, how does this passage contribute to that message that God will raise up and deliver his people in all sorts of different ways for such a time as this? Although the Jews are scattered throughout 127 provinces, and many of them are immense distances from Jerusalem, they are also scattered at the very heart of power in Persia. There are Jews present in Susa at this time, perhaps for such a time as this. So those that may consider themselves on the very edge of the community of faith might actually be the very ones to redeem it. Powerful, powerful words. It's an awesome story. Is it persuasive though? Has Mordecai won the day? Will Esther boldly go? Well, the answer is yes. And Esther's words follow. Go, she says, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. And those words, if I perish, indicate her willingness to give up her life on behalf of her people. And so she will step away from feasting and drinking. And feasting and drinking at the very heart of the story of Esther, as we will see in the next 3 chapters, revolves around feasting and drinking. But at this point, she will forego feasting and drinking. And it had me thinking, what is that about? I don't know how many of you fast. I know that some people fast because the science says that if you have a late breakfast, you probably lose weight a little bit faster, so maybe that's why people fast. They're certainly not doing it for this reason, which is the one described here by Esther. It's a very spiritual reason. But if we think about fasting at its most basic, what are you actually doing? You are giving up that which will sustain your life. You're foregoing that which will keep you alive. This is a pretty serious fast. We're not just giving up breakfast. They're giving up food and water for 3 days. They are symbolically, figuratively, they are going into the grave. They are giving up life for 3 days. And then she will approach the king. And her community, she calls on her community to join her in this living death. And if she perishes, she perishes. Esther is no longer passive. Her words and Mordecai's words have turned her inaction into action. She is acting on behalf of others for their good, and she's doing it in full knowledge of the potential sacrifice. This is her high point. In our Bible study, we're working through Every Good Endeavour by Tim Keller, and providentially, is that the word? Providentially, which I guess is the title of the sermon, which I haven't talked about at all. But providentially, this week in that book, Tim wrote about this very chapter and this very circumstance. And he talks about Esther and the implications of Esther for how we work, and I strongly recommend the book. It's very, very interesting. But one of the throwaway comments he makes in it is that in the book of Esther, one commentator has noticed that Esther is called Queen Esther 14 times. 13 of those times come after this decision. Before this, she was queen in title only. After this decision, she was queen in practice because she was leading her people. I thought that was profound. And we're going to read almost immediately next week in chapters 5 to 7, Queen Esther, Queen Esther, Queen Esther. She is queen now. She is active. She has acted. But how are we to respond to this passage? What does this have for us? I hope you've picked up there are some distinct echoes of Jesus in Esther's actions. He also had a decision to make, to lay down his life for his people. The anguish and cost of that decision were clear for all to see in Gethsemane. He sweated blood over this decision. And he had to follow through, whilst, I don't want to give any spoilers, Esther doesn't. But there are clear echoes of Jesus. I know I have a tendency perhaps to draw a long bow when I look at the Old Testament and think about Jesus, but I don't think it's maybe it is just a coincidence. Maybe it's a providential coincidence that she calls a fast for 3 days. She gives up life for 3 days. There are echoes there, I think. But that's me drawing my long bow. So if Esther is a type of Jesus in laying down her life, potentially, for her people, then we too are called to precisely that sacrifice. 1 John 3:16 states, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers." It's exactly what Esther did. It's what Jesus did, and it's what we're called to do. But I guess the real question is, what does that actually look like in practice? Because even though we all know in our heads that that is in fact what the Christian life is about, we are called to take up our cross daily and follow him, which is nothing more than what Esther is teaching us here. We must give up our life every day for Jesus. It's not something that we commonly are doing. I'm not sure that I've been called to make an Esther-type decision yesterday or the day before. So what does it actually mean in practice? And I was drawn to the fascinating subplot that runs through all of this book. Because remember, up until this point, Esther has been told to hide who she is. Her identity as a Jew is hidden. It's a secret. Probably the first that the people around her and who have lived with her for 6 or 7 years is when she goes down to Mordecai and Hathach says, Well, Hathach hears from Mordecai, because he outs her, don't think you're going to escape. That might be the first mention that the people who she has lived with, first inkling that she is in fact one of God's people. And Haman was not joking when he said that there are a group amongst you who don't obey your laws and who are different and shouldn't be tolerated. He wasn't joking. The Jews were different. Mordecai is a classic Jew in that sense. He is stubborn. He has his own ways. He's going to follow God and no one else. He's going to do things differently to all those around about. And it had me thinking, okay, is that something that can be said of us? Should that be something that can be said of us? Are we, as Christians, as God's people, so different from the world that we invite opposition? The answer of the New Testament is absolutely. Jesus himself says, your differences in how you behave together and how you behave in the world will mark you out, just as the Jews were marked out in ancient Persia. And it got me thinking, how are we different? How are we marked? How are we to be different? And we live in a culture where the self is everything. We're constantly encouraged to be our best selves. Anything that prevents us from being authentic is to be opposed. We are to be fully realised individuals. That is what society tells us to be. And I was reflecting this week on just how different that is to the gospel. Because the gospel has a completely different message to the world. It says that it's not about yourself. You have to give up yourself for others. Your identity is not to be fulfilled and satisfied and have the good life as the world would say it. Your identity is to be found with Jesus. So I'll put the call out to the Zoom session afterwards. I'm just wondering if it's worth having a conversation about how different we are. What is it about us as a Christian community that is distinctive, that would invite trouble? I'm not saying that we need to invite trouble, that we need to be obnoxious and stubborn like Mordecai was. Mordecai got his whole people into an awful lot of trouble, and there's no real justification for that. But we are called to be different, as the Jews were recognisably different in the ancient world. And I'm wondering, how do we look different to the world today? And that's where I think the last song is actually really quite important. The last song we're going to sing today is, "Yet not I, but through Christ in me." Is that where our identity is found? Our identity is wholly found in the death and life of Jesus. Let's pray. Lord, help us to be a community that stands together and supports one another in being identified with you. Help us to be a community of believers that, when looked upon from the outside, people say, "See how they love one another." Help us to be a community that will fast together and pray together and live together and find our identity in you and in in your people here in this place. We ask these things in your name. Amen.